Everybody swore his 426 Hemi could smoke anything Ford ever built. Then a Boss 429 Mustang rolled up at the drag strip, and everything he believed about Mopar supremacy got challenged by Ford's most secretive weapon. This is the story of two legendary engines that represent the ultimate clash between Detroit's biggest rivals, and the shocking truth about which one actually ruled the streets when it mattered most. The 426 Hemi earned its reputation the hard way, by demolishing everything else on the drag strips of America. From its 1966 debut in street form through the end of the muscle car era, the Hemi was the engine every competitor measured themselves against. That distinctive elephant motor sound became the soundtrack of fear for anyone foolish enough to line up against it. But the Hemi story started in professional racing, where Chrysler's engineers had already proven what hemispherical combustion chambers could do. The race Hemis had been dominating NASCAR and NHRA competitions since 1964, setting records that seemed impossible to break. When Chrysler finally offered a street version in 1966, they weren't just selling an engine. They were offering civilians a chance to own genuine racing technology. Mopar built the Hemi for one purpose: to win. The hemispherical combustion chambers that gave the engine its name weren't just engineering elegance, they were a declaration of war. While competitors focused on marketing and styling, Chrysler's engineers created an engine that turned gasoline into pure violence. The design was radical for its time. Most V8s used wedge-shaped combustion chambers that were compact and cheap to manufacture. The Hemi's spherical chambers required complex valve arrangements and expensive machining, but they delivered something no wedge chamber could match: perfect airflow and complete combustion. Every drop of fuel became power, and every breath of air became speed. The numbers told the story. In 1968, Car and Driver tested a road runner with the 426 Hemi and recorded a 13.5-second quarter mile at 105 miles per hour. Performance that left even seasoned testers speechless. Motor Trend called it the most feared engine in America, and every teenager with a driver's license knew exactly what that meant. Hot Rod Magazine's test of a 1970 Cuda Hemi produced a 13.10 at 107 miles per hour, numbers that made it faster than most exotic sports cars costing twice as much. But these were conservative results. Street racers with properly tuned Hemis were running deep into the 12 seconds, sometimes touching the 11 seconds when everything was perfect. And yet, the official rating was just 425 horsepower, a number Chrysler deliberately understated to appease insurance companies and keep the government regulators from killing the performance car market entirely. In truth, dyno tests showed closer to 500 horsepower, and some well-built examples exceeded even that. Numbers so big they scared even the drivers who unleashed them. But the Hemi wasn't just powerful, it had a personality that separated it from every other engine Detroit had ever built. Temperamental, sometimes frustrating, but when the tune was right, it became a force of nature. Cold mornings meant long warm-ups. Hot days required careful throttle work to prevent detonation. But when conditions were perfect and the Hemi was dialed in, it delivered acceleration that felt like being shot from a cannon. Driving one wasn't like owning a car, it was like taming a wild animal. The Hemi demanded respect, skill, and constant attention. But for those who understood its moods and mastered its quirks, it delivered performance that redefined what a street car could do. Ford's response was the Boss 429, an engine so radical it forced engineers to completely rework the Mustang just to fit it inside. This wasn't just another big block thrown into a pony car. This was Ford's declaration that they could build something even more devastating than the legendary Hemi. The Boss 429 existed for one reason: NASCAR supremacy. Ford's racing division had analyzed what it would take to dominate the high-speed superspeedways, and the answer was a motor that could breathe at stratospheric RPM while delivering endless top-end power. But NASCAR's homologation rules required at least 500 street versions to be built and sold to the public. Those 500 cars became 1,359 across 1969 and 1970 model years, and every single one was a hand-built masterpiece. Ford contracted car craft, their Special Projects Division, to perform the complex modifications required to shoehorn the massive Boss motor into the Mustang's engine bay. The engineering challenges were immense. The Boss 429's massive cylinder heads were so wide that the Mustang's shock towers had to be cut out and relocated. The entire front suspension geometry was altered. Battery placement was moved. Even the hood required special reinforcement to handle the engine's torque reactions. Each car took weeks to complete, with skilled technicians hand-fitting every component. The result was essentially a factory race car disguised as a street machine. The official rating? Just 375 horsepower, a number so conservative it was almost insulting to anyone who understood what this engine really was. Independent testing revealed the truth. Properly tuned Boss 429s were producing well over 500 horsepower at the flywheel. Some dyno sheets showed numbers approaching 600, but the Boss delivered that power differently than any other engine on the road. At low RPMs, the Boss felt almost tame, even lazy compared to the Hemi's immediate violence. The massive ports and enormous valves that made it a high RPM monster actually worked against it in street driving. But once the tachometer swung past 4,500 RPM, the transformation was dramatic. It wasn't just acceleration, it was a crescendo of mechanical fury that kept building until the limiter intervened. Where other engines ran out of breath at high RPM, the Boss just kept pulling harder. It turned quarter-mile strips into physics lessons about what happened when unlimited breathing met unlimited fuel flow. The rivalry between these two engines wasn't just mechanical, it was deeply cultural, dividing American performance enthusiasts into warring camps. Car magazines fed the fire with constant comparisons, each test promising to finally settle the question of supremacy. Mopar fans claimed the Hemi's brute force approach was pure American power. Ford loyalists countered that the Boss represented sophisticated engineering triumph over crude force. This wasn't just bench racing. On Friday nights at drag strips across America, the arguments were settled the old-fashioned way, head-to-head combat at the Christmas tree. The encounters became legendary among those who witnessed them. Stories passed down through generations of gearheads who understood they were watching history unfold. A well-tuned Hemi in a lightweight Cuda or Challenger could run consistent high 12 seconds to low 13 seconds in the quarter mile, depending on driver skill and track conditions. The Boss 429, once its complex induction system was properly sorted by someone who understood its breathing requirements, could match those times blow for blow. CarCraft's famous comparison test between a Cuda Hemi and Boss 429 Mustang produced nearly identical elapsed times in the low 13 seconds. Their conclusion became gospel among street racers. It wasn't the badge on the hood that won races. It was the preparation, the driver skill, and sometimes just pure luck. Street racers who lived through this era remember the tension at tracks when both engines showed up. Some nights, the Hemi ruled through sheer force, its instant torque overwhelming anything that dared challenge it. Other nights, the Boss would demonstrate its high RPM superiority, pulling past Hemis in the final 100 feet when lesser engines had given up. The deciding factor wasn't always raw horsepower. Track conditions, altitude, air temperature, humidity, all affected these highly tuned monsters differently. A Hemi thrived in cool, dense air where its aggressive compression could work without detonation. The Boss preferred conditions that let it rev freely, where its superior breathing could overcome the Hemi's torque advantage. Both engines attracted their own tribes of specialists, tuners who understood the subtle arts of carburetor jetting, ignition timing, and camshaft selection that separated winners from spectators. These weren't casual weekend warriors. These were engineers disguised as street racers, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with Detroit iron. Technically, the Hemi and Boss 429 represented completely different philosophies for extracting maximum power from internal combustion. The Hemi's hemispherical chambers maximized flame travel efficiency and allowed enormous valves for superior breathing. But this design required complex rocker arm geometry and expensive manufacturing processes that limited production numbers and increased costs. The Boss took a different approach. Rather than revolutionary combustion chamber design, Ford's engineers focused on port flow and valve sizing that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with conventional architecture. The result was an engine that could move more air per minute than anything else on the road, but only when spinning at speeds that would destroy lesser motors. The maintenance requirements told another story about their different personalities. Hemis were notoriously finicky, demanding constant attention to timing, jetting, and valve adjustment. The solid lifter camshafts required frequent checking, and the high-maintenance valve train could turn an afternoon drive into a mechanical adventure. The Boss, while still requiring specialist knowledge, was slightly more tolerant of neglect, though finding replacement parts was nearly impossible even when the cars were new. Ford had built so few that the parts network barely existed, making every Boss 429 a precious commodity that owners protected like museum pieces. Both approaches created monsters that transcended their mechanical specifications. They became cultural symbols that defined American automotive ambition during the final golden age of unrestricted performance. The Hemi represented the blue-collar ideal, raw, honest power that anyone could understand and respect. The Boss embodied the engineer's dream, sophisticated technology pushed to its absolute limits. These engines shaped more than race results. They shaped identity, loyalty, and decades of automotive passion that continues today. Mopar guys wore Hemi ownership like a badge of honor, proof they understood what real power meant. Ford enthusiasts bragged about owning the rarest Mustang ever built, the unicorn that could take down anything Detroit had ever created. Together, they elevated the entire muscle car era to legendary status. Every argument about horsepower, every debate about quarter-mile times, every discussion of what made American cars special inevitably returned to these two engines and what they represented about automotive possibility. Today, both the Hemi and Boss 429 exist as automotive legends whose influence extends far beyond their original production runs. Restored Hemi cars command six-figure prices at prestigious auctions like Barrett-Jackson and Mecum. Boss 429 Mustangs, thanks to their extreme rarity and racing pedigree, often bring even more, sometimes exceeding $200,000 for exceptional examples. But the real value isn't measured in auction dollars. It's in the technological DNA they passed to modern performance cars. Today's Dodge Hellcat engines owe their fundamental architecture to lessons learned from the original 426 Hemi, the supercharged 6.2-liter power plants that produce over 700 horsepower use, updated versions of hemispherical combustion chamber principles pioneered 50 years ago. Ford's modern Coyote 5.8 and the supercharged mills in current Shelby GT500s borrow heavily from the Boss 429's breathing philosophy. The emphasis on high RPM power delivery, sophisticated port design, and maximum airflow capacity traces directly back to the lessons learned during the Boss program. Every muscle car rolling off production lines today, whether it's a Camaro ZL1, Challenger Hellcat, or Mustang Shelby GT500, stands in the shadow of what the Hemi and Boss 429 proved possible during America's greatest performance era. They established benchmarks for power, acceleration, and mechanical drama that still define what we expect from truly great engines. Modern safety regulations, emission standards, and fuel economy requirements have changed how engineers approach performance. But the fundamental goals remain identical: build the most powerful, most exciting engines possible within the constraints of their era. And maybe that's the real legacy of the 426 Hemi versus Boss 429 rivalry. They proved what happened when engineers were told to forget compromise and build for one goal: maximum power. They remind us of a golden age when performance mattered more than fuel economy, when bragging rights meant more than emissions compliance. and when the sound of a properly tuned V8 at full throttle was considered one of America's greatest cultural achievements. Both engines pushed their respective manufacturers to technological heights that seemed impossible. They forced innovation in metallurgy, combustion science, and mechanical design that influenced decades of automotive development. Most importantly, they created a standard of excellence that refused to accept good enough as an answer. The Hemi taught the world that brute force, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle. The Boss 429 proved that sophisticated engineering could extract performance that seemed to defy physics. Together, they established the template for what American muscle cars could be when imagination met determination. So who won the ultimate battle between Mopar and Ford's greatest engines? The truth is, anyone who experienced either power plant at full throttle came out ahead. The 426 Hemi and Boss 429 weren't just engines, they were declarations of what was possible when power was everything and compromise was unacceptable. They represent the pinnacle of an era when American automotive engineers were given unlimited budgets and told to build the fastest, most powerful cars the world had ever seen. That kind of freedom produced machines that still define our understanding of what muscle cars should be. Which one would you choose for the ultimate street machine? The Hemi's instant brutal torque or the Boss 429's high RPM fury? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories about the legendary engines that built America's performance reputation 1/4 mile at a time.